I'm John Vinolas, and I'm really excited to be here with Aaron Lopresti. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to have you again. We had a little bit of a technical snafu when we tried to do this last time, and after our hour and a half recording session, we realized that we hadn't captured your audio. And in fairness, you told me at the very beginning, technical heavy lifting and you are not things that we want to necessarily put in the same sentence together. So you weren't
No, it's
lying. That
true.
was true.
But pushing a button shouldn't be that hard. But I guess this is the lesson to be learned. You don't call me up and say, "Hey, let's do an interview," and then expect me to record it, because you could get a disaster, and that's exactly what happened. But we're rolling this time. We're ready to go. We're ready to go.
Well, now there will be no further delays or screw ups or anything, and we can just get right into it. I would. I'd love to hear about about how your career got started, and I understand, or I remember you said it wasn't like a bolt or like a big break that just kind of happened all at once. It was kind of a long, kind of a whole process, wasn't it?
It was more of a crawl. Like most comic book artists or wannabe comic book artists, you hope you make a big splash, right? You hope the first thing you do is like Arthur Adams' Long Shot or something, and you're suddenly a star, and everything goes smoothly. But for me, I went to film school first at USC, and I was kind of headed in that direction.
And okay, real quick, I just want to ask you, what was it that pulled you toward film school? I was interested in that last time. We didn't get a chance to ask that question.
When I was always a big film fan, even as a young kid, mostly fantasy or, monster films, Universal monster films, things like that. Okay. But I was always a big fan of film, as my mom was. And so we watched a lot of movies, together. But I was always an artist. It's like I was in diapers with a pencil. You know what I mean? I was always drawing. Okay. And so I just felt like, initially animation was where I wanted to go, as I was copying, Popeye and Flintstone cartoons. And then, and then when I discovered comic books at age 9 or 10, I thought they were the most amazing things in the world. So my focus went completely to comic books, and that's all I was working on and drawing and stuff, although still being a huge film fan, but never really thinking about that in terms of anything other than just, entertainment. We had a high school English teacher who was a big film fan, and he started a film production class using all the old Super 8 movie cameras that the school used to have to record all the sporting events, because they switched to video. Wow. Yeah. And then they had all these Super 8 cameras left that they were not using anymore. So he collected all of them and started a film production class. So a friend of mine and I took this class. We made a film. We won an award in a regional film contest. And so that sort of planted the seed in the back of my mind, right?
Okay, so just real quick, out of curiosity, what was that film about?
We went into a meat packing plant and filmed. We filmed basically cows being slaughtered, and then cut up and sent to the to market. And it was. Our intent was never to make some sort of propaganda film, like anti-meat film or, but it kind of turned into that by its own, as we started editing it and putting it together, like any good documentary, you start thinking, well, let's start pointing this in a direction that's more interesting than just presenting material, right? Which all documentaries do. Right. And so it wasn't something we necessarily had convictions about, but we just saw it as, it was going down this path. So let's really push it. Wow. And so it became this sort of propaganda film against, slaughtering animals and taking it all the way to the grocery store. And, we would go out and have hamburgers after we would shoot, you know what I mean? Right, so it wasn't anything that was really
not super principled.
Yeah, no, not at all. But we did, like I said, we did win this award. And so that was kind of in the back of my mind that like, hey, but I never seriously, even at that point, considered it. But when I went to college, my first year of college, I went to Oregon State on a bit going to take business instead of art, which just speaks
Oh,
to the
okay.
arrogance I had as a young man and didn't really have perspective on, that I really needed to work on my art skills. But I was thinking if I went and got a business degree, I could handle my own contracts, and which is not what a business degree is at all. But you kind of
Right.
imagine this stuff in your head.
Uh-huh. Sure.
Well, I couldn't handle the math portion of the show, and so I left Oregon State, having been kicked out of the business program because my specific grades for my business degree, the only classes I took my freshman year were like a couple of really sort of calculus math classes, and I did not do well in them. So they kicked me. They didn't kick me out of the university. They just kicked me out of that major. But I was like, and that's when I started thinking, you know what? Why don't you go to film school and pursue film? And so that, I went to a junior college and got all my general ed requirements out of the way,
Okay.
and then started doing research into film schools during that time and sent out all sorts of information, getting applications, and eventually I got accepted to USC, and I didn't ever think about how I'd pay for it because we had no money. I mean, I come from a lower middle income family that was,
Hmm.
just lower income before my mom started working when we were younger. So we didn't have a lot of money, but I worry, I'll just take out loans and whatever. And that's a whole nother story. But so
Yeah.
managed to work my way through film school. And I got out of school and I was working at TriStar Pictures, reading scripts, which sounds maybe a bit interesting, but it was really horrible pay, tons of pressure. It just it wasn't a job that necessarily was going to lead any place.
Okay.
And so when there was a writer's strike, and when there was a writer's strike, I was out of work. And so I started temping down in LA. And that's when you start thinking, what am I doing?
Hmm.
And I started to reevaluate whether or not I really wanted, and at that point as a Christian, I was also kind of looking at the landscape of Hollywood, and it was, it's 10 times worse now than it was then, or at least publicly it's worse. It may not have been any worse, privately
Right.
back then. But you start getting an inside track on what that stuff is like, and the compromises you may have to make morally
Yeah.
or spiritually or whatever. And I started thinking, you know what? I don't think after all, this is really what I should be doing, that, necessarily God wants me doing, I
Yeah.
don't know that God wanted me in comics, but that was the only other thing I knew. Right.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so I contacted a small publishing company called Blackthorn that I'd seen publishing some really crappy comics in my comic shop down there. And I thought, well, I know I'm not going to walk into Marvel or DC and get handed a job. So, I thought, well, I'll start here and work my way up. Right. And so I did a comic for them called Solomon Kane 3D. So it came with the 3D glasses and everything.
Right.
And, it was horrible, but, it was my first step into the real world of comics. And
So real quick, I'm curious about the mechanics of the 3D. Did you just do your regular line art, and then they did made it into 3D for you, or did you have to do anything special because it was going to be a
no,
3D comic?
no, they did that in the separations. It was black
Yeah.
line artwork, and then they just separated like the red and green. So it was like,
Okay.
how do they do this? So it's off centered a little bit,
Yeah.
and then the glasses pull it back together, and it's 3D or whatever.
Right. Right.
Um, yeah. So after that, then I moved home, which is always humiliating when you're, I don't know what I was, 25 or something,
Right.
and you're moving back in after 6 years of college.
Yeah.
And, and, I was lucky enough. I like temp worked in Portland, Oregon, which is not the same as temping in LA. In LA, you get like office jobs and law firms, and you actually felt like you had a real job. You're wearing a tie and everything.
Mm-hmm.
In Portland, it was like, filling up cassette trays for Payless, or, one of the, I'm trying to think of a store that you guys, someplace other than Portland would recognize, but
Yeah,
Kmart, something like that, you'd
sure.
putting together these cassette tapes with the Beach
Wow.
Boys in them or whatever that you would be in display to go in the store. And with,
Okay.
screwing lids on horseradish. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. I literally did that. And
Wow.
and so I was like, uh, I was really kind of at a crossroads, not really sure where my life was going. And this is, uh, and then I was able to find out about this. I don't remember how, but I found out about a commercial art studio when they still had those in Portland. And I took my portfolio down there and showed them my work, and they were like, "Yeah, we could use you." And so they hired me, but it was totally freelance, right? There was no salary or anything. I just basically got paid for the work that I did,
Hmm.
and they kept me pretty busy for uh, about a year and a half, and then I started once again trying to put together my portfolio and trying to get work at Marvel and DC, and what I did was when I was down in LA, I started going to San Diego Comic-Con because it dawned on me, hey, biggest Comic-Con in the world, why am I not going? It's just down the road. And so I had been there a couple times as a fan, but then I went, I went every year, even if I had to fly down there to do it. Or actually, in those days, we drove down. I had no money for airfare, and stay in the cheapest motel you could find, and then
Right.
go and show your portfolio, which is what I did in when was it? 91 probably. And Terry Cavanaugh, who was an editor at Marvel, was the only one who showed any sort of interest in the book, and he was editing or interest in my art. And he was editing a book called Marvel Comics Presents, which was bi-weekly, or it might have been weekly. It came out every week or came out I think it was weekly actually, that this book came out, right? So it had a short Wolverine story that John Buscema was doing in the front of it. And then it was just full of like backup stories by whoever they could hire to draw, right?
Yeah.
And so he said, well, I might be able to use you on Marvel Comics Presents. I took that as I'm hired,
Right.
And so I would start, and we had no internet right back then. So it was, phone calls, and I would phone call and get the answering machine and all that kind of stuff, and really got nowhere, and realized that if I was going to get anywhere, I was going to have to fly back to New York and, go to Marvel, show my portfolio, go to DC, show my portfolio. So I started doing that. I'd save my money, money I made at the commercial art studio, doing commercial art, like storyboards for commercials or newspaper ads and those type of things that required illustration. And so then I'd fly back to New York and stay at the cheapest place I could. And some of them were pretty cheap and kind of scary.
Yeah.
And then I would go to Marvel and DC, I'd stay there a week if I could, and just hit up Marvel and DC and try and get in to see editors and stuff. And one of the things I did at Marvel that benefited me in the long run was I made friends with the receptionist there at Marvel. And so in subsequent trips, whenever I called to talk to an editor, I would talk to her first,
Right.
and then pretty soon she knew me, and then there was a face to the name, and, we had to talk about her kids and all that kind of stuff. And so she started letting me in when I wasn't supposed to be in, when I didn't have an appointment. Right. So it was a great connection on my part. Sweet talk, the receptionist, And so she would let me in, and then I would just go wander around Marvel trying to look for an editor whose door was open and go in and bug him. And I was able to track down Terry Cavanaugh, and I went in and I said, hey, remember when you promised me at San Diego last year that you'd give me a job, and he was like, what, who are you, but because I was a relentless, pesterer, he finally gave me a Marvel Comics Presents job. And that was Marvel Comics Presents 39, which was a Spider-Man story that I did a horrible job on. And then I thought I was in, I made it, but, it was radio silence, and the whole process started over again, every 6 months going back to New York, phone calling, sometimes daily, trying to get any editor that would answer their phone, and, you could bug them about a job, and sending in your Xerox copies of your work, which would sit in a pile on their desk. Maybe someday they would open them, maybe they wouldn't, so it was really challenging back then. And, but I eventually picked up on a book called What the, which was their parody book.
Right.
And Terry Kavanaugh was the initial editor on that book, and I think he gave me my first assignment. But then it went over to Renee Witterstatter. So having done one already, I was able to go to Renee and say, hey, I already did this Forbish Man story. I'd like to do more.
Right.
And so, well, it figured he always had a soft spot in my heart from way back. And when I was a kid, reading those old Not Brand Echh comics that when Marvel first started parodying themselves back in 67 or 68, whenever it was. And so I thought, well, I'll bring him back and he can be the host of the book again. Right. And so they were fine with it. And she kept giving me assignments, but it wasn't every month, right? It was every other month, every couple issues, I would get a Forbish Man story. And so I'd go back to Portland and work in the commercial art studio and then work on a Forbish Man story, mail it in. And then in 6 months I'd go back and the whole process would start over. And I got to know Renee pretty well. We became friends. And so she would put me up at her apartment when I came into town in New York. So I didn't have to worry about, paying for a motel or a hotel or whatever.
Going to the sketchy hotels again.
Right, exactly. So that was really nice of her. And so she was also really good friends with Michael Golden, and she still is. She still reps him. And he was the art director at DC at the time. So she introduced me to him. And I think he was a little, he wondered if I was trying to put the moves on Renee or something, staying in her apartment. And so he was over there all the time the week I was there. And so I was able to get to know him really well and pick his brain. And he was able to, for the first time in my life at that point, he was able to articulate the stuff that was wrong with my work and why I couldn't get superhero work. I was getting this stuff, but I couldn't get any superhero work or any what we'd call, main stream sort of, stuff at Marvel. And so having talked to him and he was pointing out, where my dynamics were lacking, where I thought something was really dynamic and it wasn't and why it wasn't, then he would, and he would show me other examples of stuff. And it really just, the bells went off in my head, the light bulb went off, and I
can you give us like a quick example of like what you mean, like what needed to be more dynamic and what was going on that like really.
Right. The two things that stood out were my facial expressions. Okay. I wasn't pushing them far enough. You're doing these little subtle things, right? That you think, oh, he's being sly here or whatever. And the expression didn't really read all that different than, oh, he's being angry and, oh, he's being sad. You know what I mean? Because I wasn't pushing the acting of it enough. And he would show me examples of like Kyle Baker and how exaggerated Kyle Baker's expressions and body language were. And you start to realize, okay, maybe I'm not going to push it as far as Kyle Baker did, but you started to understand what needed to be done. Right. And what I thought I was doing, being all clever and subtle, I was not getting my message across. And then he would show me, like, if I picked a low angle shot to draw a character from, I would kind of like do a medium low angle. I didn't really push it. I was not pushing my work far enough to really make it dynamic. I was just kind of stuck in the middle, in this sort of mediocre visual style.
Okay. So you weren't going for it.
No. Yeah. But you think you are, right? You think you're doing it right. And you go, yeah, this is really dynamic. And they're like, no, it isn't, and then editors could tell you that. And they would use like weird language that you didn't really understand. And they would say stuff, like would they ever say, well, your Punisher's not gritty enough. Okay, well, what does that mean? You know what I mean?
Right,
and
sure.
So, but an artist of his caliber was able to just articulate those things to me. And I was able to grasp them and really understand. And then, of course, it's on you or me in that case to, it's like they say, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Right.
It was up to me to be able to manifest that in my work, not just say, oh, yeah, I get it, but now can I actually do it? And so I had a weekend there because I always go in the middle of the week, stay the weekend, and then into the middle of the next week before I'd leave. That's how I would do the week, right? And so I took the weekend because Renee was out of town that weekend or something, doing something. And so I was unencumbered from Friday night, Saturday, all day Sunday. I worked on this 3-page Wolverine Hulk kind of fight scene thing.
Okay.
And I created this little story where Wolverine was being held captive in this mad scientist lab, and then the Hulk broke down the wall, and come in and rescued him, but then they faced off, or something like that. And
Right.
But it was showcasing dynamic stuff, right? Fight
Okay.
stuff and all that kind of stuff that
Sure.
you'd get a reaction from. And so that Monday, Renee took me into work with her at Marvel and introduced me to Danny Fingeroth, who was doing a bunch of background comics, or pardon me, he was getting a bunch of background backup stories for Spider-Man, because this was Mark Bagley's run on Spider-Man and he was doing it bi-weekly, so 2 issues a month. And
yeah,
so
that was the run when he had the Carnage arc, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Man, I love Mark Bagley's Spider-Man so much. Like that Carnage run, that mini arc of 3 issues is so epic. And then of course when he went on to do Ultimate Spider-Man, that just sort of, I feel like that was another visual step forward for Spider-Man, kind of in the same way that like McFarlane was.
Yes, it was. I mean, he was on it for so long that he sort of defined that era of Spider-Man, right? Just as McFarlane did when he was on it, and Eric Larson to a lesser extent, I think, after McFarlane. But then Bagley really sort of became the face of Spider-Man for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And so I did a few backups, and the first one I did, I just felt this enormous pressure, right? Oh, it's my first superhero job, even though it wasn't a superhero story. I think it was Aunt May or something. I don't know what it was, but so I kind of overthought everything, and I just really choked, and he wasn't too impressed with it. In fact, he was basically, I think he gave me 2 stories, and he was just like, he called me up on the phone because I had gone back, of course, to Portland, was doing these in Portland, shipping them to New York. And he was just like, yeah, Aaron, it just isn't doing it for me. I'm going to have to cut you loose. And Danny, who's a very nice guy, and we sort of laugh about this stuff now whenever I run into him. But I was like, because I just every time I see him, I profusely thank him for giving me another shot. Because I just said, look, I get it. I said, I'm not pleased with these either. I said, I kind of was feeling the pressure of working, on a superhero book for Marvel. Just give me another chance. Let me do some sample pages for you, some new sample pages, so I can show you that I understand what the problem is and that we can go forward.
Yeah.
And so I sent him the sample story, like 5 pages or something. I think it was Spider-Man Kraven the Hunter. I can't remember. Again, sort of focusing on action sequences and dynamics as opposed to, Aunt May going to Uncle Ben's gravesite, getting in a cab, which was one of the stories I had to draw, And so once again, the dynamics of it caught his eye. Well, then he actually sent me something that was Spider-Man, and actually Spider-Man doing something. And, so that turned into Spider-Man Unlimited, a couple stories in there. And then there was Spider-Man annuals. I did several stories in Spider-Man annuals, and he was totally happy with what I was doing. And so I was starting to make connections with different editors like Nell Yomtoff. I did if you remember Darkhawk, I did the Darkhawk annual for him.
Man, Darkhawk for me is such an underrated character. Like Darkhawk was really cool.
Yeah.
And maybe that's like, maybe it's just like sort of the 90s nostalgia, like kid for me, that like he had such a striking visual about him. And there was a lot of I don't know, I feel like there was a lot of like the Dark Force was being used a lot in the early 90s in comics, and that was kind of a neat idea that was there a lot. But yeah, like Darkhawk has done, like, weird stuff has happened to Darkhawk since then. He turned out he's like from the Shi'ar and
I got to admit, I never kept up with it. But he was a very cool character. He was very different, and visually cool.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun to work on that. And then that sort of, I was starting to get in at Marvel, but my page rate was back then, I think, I can't remember if it was either $75 or $85 or 80, somewhere in that neighborhood, which was, what they started guys out with back then in, 1991.
Yeah.
1990, 91. And about that time, Malibu Comics, who had just up to that point had just published black and white stuff like Dinosaurs for Hire. They did, they did publish Men in Black, and a bunch of horror comics that were all black and white. But they had hooked up with the Image guys, and they distributed the Image Comics, published and distributed Image Comics for the first year before Image just took it all over themselves.
Yeah.
And during that time, they made enough money doing that they were able to launch their own superhero comic line. They wanted to get out of the black and white movement and get into mainstream comics. And so they were launching the Ultraverse. And this was probably 92. And I was still working in comics part-time. I was still doing the trip from Portland to New York every 6 months to see what I could, to maintain relationships or grow relationships. Yeah. And I was still working in commercial art. But so they contacted me. I met them at a con, actually. They came up and talked to me. Dave Ulbrich, who was the publisher, and Tom Mason, who was the one of the editors there, writers and editors there. And they talked to me in general terms. They didn't, but they said they'd be in touch. And then they got in touch with me and said, this is what we're doing. Are you interested? And they had the superhero line. They had this monster book called Sludge, and that was immediately the thing I gravitated to and wanted to do.
Yeah.
I could never quite explain being a Christian kid and an adult and having such a fascination with monsters, but there it is. They're more fun to draw, I guess. But
sure.
So they offered me this, and at $135 a page, where I was making, 80 or whatever it was at Marvel. And it was like, that's almost double what I was making. I mean, it wasn't quite, but it was two-thirds what I was making at Marvel. And I was supposed to take over She-Hulk. And then they took it out from under me at the last minute because John Romita Sr., the art director, looked at my stuff and said, this guy's not ready for a monthly book. And he was right. But at that time, I didn't think so, right? You're like, hey, I was supposed to do this. And, I found an inker, Gary Martin, that I was going to work with. And we were going to take over She-Hulk right after Byrne left. And then it got kind of pulled out from underneath me. So I was ticked off. And then this offer from Malibu came in. And I said, well, I'm going to go take the money and go do this.
Well, wow. It's kind of, I feel like probably at this point, you feel like you dodged a bullet not having to follow the John Byrne Act.
Yeah, probably. Well, especially I wasn't that good at that point. And it was like, I still had several years, I think, of grooming. I mean, that in the sense of developing, as an artist that needed to be done. And when I went to Malibu, they were totally hands off. They just said, do what you want to do. And so I had no pressure. And so I started doing interesting things with my storytelling. The things I did artistically started to expand, and Sludge became the first real professional looking work that I felt like that I had done. The Dark Arc Annual was close, but this I thought was like, this got me recognized. Now, I don't think it's great looking back in retrospect, but at the time, it was that first step where I felt like, yes, okay, I'm doing professional work and people are noticing it. And so that really helped my career. The problem was, in the short term it did, but in the long term, I stayed with Malibu because I really enjoyed working there, and I enjoyed the guys and had great relationships with everybody that was, working there. And so I hung on too long when other people were jumping ship and going to Marvel and DC, kind of riding that wave that initial wave that they had struck, with their when their books first launched and they were getting a lot of attention. Then they would jump ship and go to Marvel and DC.
Right.
I kept staying and kind of went down with the ship with Malibu, and then found myself sort of scrambling to find work again. So I got stuff at Valiant. I got stuff at DC.
Now, with the Malibu, didn't Marvel acquire the Malibu IP stuff not too long ago? I feel like there was a there was like an Avengers Ultraverse crossover that happened
Yeah, the
not
real
real long ago.
well, it was 94, probably
Oh wow.
95. So it was a
Okay.
while ago. It doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was. And
I
I
thought
had
no,
hair
I thought there
back
was a
then.
more recent one for some reason.
Well,
But maybe I might be making that up. Sorry, go ahead.
you might be, because I don't recall. But again, I don't pay that much attention to what's going on anymore.
Yeah.
When I did when when I was breaking in or younger in the industry. But Marvel, what happened was Malibu was going under, but DC made an offer, and DC was going to buy them, and actually the feeling was that DC was buying them to actually use them as, like a Vertigo or something like that, that they would
Uh-huh.
maintain the line and keep it going, but with a DC tag on it would boost it and make it a viable, because some of the characters were actually pretty good. And Marvel came in and made a higher offer because they just didn't want DC to get it, but they had no intention of ever using
Oh
it.
man.
So there was this transition period where they were like, we were swapping characters, and I say we, it wasn't my company, but I was working there at the time. And like, I did something that Thor crossed over in, and they
Okay.
got George Perez did this big crossover event and things like that. But then once they acquired, after a year or so of that, they just shut Malibu down and
Wow.
took the characters and put them in mothballs, and they have not seen the light of day since.
Wow.
So that's what happened there. And I guess there's contractual agreements that Marvel just does not want to deal with. And my sources, my inside sources, tell me that they never will. So
Yeah.
people that are fans of the Ultraverse stuff and wish they'd come back, it's just not going to happen because of the built-in contractual agreements to the use of those characters with creators and former publishers and those type of things. So there's too many fingers in the pie, financial pie, if you will, for those characters, and they just don't want to deal with it.
It's kind of the same reason why we're not going to ever get a standalone Hulk movie, because Universal owns the distribution rights.
Right, exactly. So there's always a problem there, and no one wants to give it up. I was shocked, that Sony actually made a deal with Marvel Entertainment to actually use Spider-Man. I was stunned that they did it, but I guess they just saw there was too many dollar signs.
Sure.
Universal probably doesn't think Hulk is a big moneymaker, which he probably is.
Well, that's because they've never read your World War Hulk run, right?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. So even though they used a little bit of it in the third Thor movie, the Ragnarok movie, but it just really sort of touched on it, and it could be a movie all by itself. And
I actually wanted to ask you about that. I feel like I've seen that there's kind of a feeling among some of the comic creators that they're not getting enough credit, or feeling like they kind of deserve a little bit more of a piece of the pie when these movies come in and make $1 billion, and what they get is a little bit of a if you stay, at least everyone's staying in through the credits to see their names there on the screen, but that's basically all they're getting most of the time, isn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes I'm the poster child because I didn't even get screen credit. This happened to me twice, actually. I mean, to answer your initial question, I don't know what everybody else is getting percentage wise, but everybody that I've talked to that has interest or has created characters that have been used in movies, they all really got jobbed,
Yeah.
One creator told me, yeah, I got enough money to buy a used car. You know what I mean? So that was kind of, what they got out of it. And which is hard to take when you see a character that you created or co-created with a writer. It's being up there and it's making $1 billion worldwide, and they're sending you a check for $10,000 or something. And you're like, wait a minute. But with me, they came out with originally with the Hulk, Planet Hulk animated movie.
Yeah, that was pretty great. I liked that one a lot.
Well, and it started off now. Admittedly, I'm not the only one who worked on the book on the storyline. Carlo Paglione was the original Hulk artist, and they contacted me because they didn't feel he was fast enough to meet the deadlines that they wanted on this Planet Hulk thing, because it was a big sort of event within the Hulk series, and they didn't want fill-in issues. They wanted to run it concurrently for a year.
Yeah.
And so, or actually longer than that. And so they contacted me and said, hey, would you be interested in doing rotating story arcs with Carlo on this? And I'm like, heck yeah, I'll do that. And so he did the first story arc. So he really laid the groundwork for the design and all that kind of stuff of what the planet looked like. And then I just, I springboarded off that for my issues. Now I designed some stuff, but I designed some aliens and things that weren't used in the movie. And, the landscape was based, I would do stuff based on what he did so that it matched what he did, that kind of thing. So, but anyway, so the animated movie came out, and before it came out, they contacted me and said the people that they hired a company to do the extras DVD, right? So there's always the movie, then there's behind the scenes and the extras, interviews, things like that.
Yeah.
And so they contacted me and said, we'd like to come to your home and interview you for this movie, right? Because I was one of the artists that worked on it. So they came and, in my studio right here, where I'm sitting right now, they came and interviewed me. So if you have that movie and you have the DVD of the extras, there's an interview with me on the extras, right? So the thing comes out. I'm all excited,
Yeah.
I get no credit anywhere. It says based on the comic by Greg Pak, who was the writer, and Carlo Paglione, who was the artist. And it wasn't Carlo Paglione and Aaron Lopresti. It was just Carlo. Yeah. And no mention of me anywhere. And yet there I am on the DVD, right? Being interviewed, and I'm not mentioned anywhere on the thing. And I got no money, right? Yeah. And so I called Marvel and complained about this, and they were very apologetic, and we don't know what happened. Really, so sorry. But that was it, right?
Yeah.
It'll never happen again, blah, blah, blah. Well, so then the Thor movie comes out with Ragnarok, and I'm sitting at the end of the movie waiting for my name, and there's Greg Pak's name, there's Carlo's name, no Aaron Lopresti again.
Oh,
so now I'm furious, right? Because I'm thinking, this is my chance to get my name in a movie credit, right?
Yeah.
And so I called him up again and complained, and they were like, well, we really only felt that we needed to give credit to the guy that did the main design work, which it wasn't you. Right. And I'm like, yeah, but I contributed over half of that storyline, or almost half, not quite half, but almost half of, I did like 100 and some pages of that story. Sure. And it's like, so you can't even thank me in the credits. I mean, I was just really upset. And so they came back and they gave me some money as an apology, but it wasn't even enough to buy a used car. But I was thankful to get it, but that's not really what I wanted. What I wanted was credit in the, so I could say, hey, look, I got credit in the movie. And so that never happened. And
that's too bad.
So that's my tragic story about, not getting any money, or very little money, and no credit. So
yeah,
there you have it.
Oh man, there was, I had another question that was going to springboard off of that, and now I forget what it was. But okay.
on to the next.
on to the next. We kind of took a sidetrack off of the story that you were telling anyway to get into that. So you were at Marvel, then you were doing backup work or backup stories. They eventually put you on that was sort of the first.
Well, I went to Malibu. I kind of
you were at Malibu.
Malibu. And Malibu went under, and I was sort of kind of scrambling to get work. And
yes,
I was able to land. I was doing odd jobs. I couldn't get anything going at Marvel. They were probably, who knows, maybe they were ticked at me because I left. To go work at Malibu. I have no idea, but I couldn't get anything going at Marvel. But I was able to get a couple of things at DC, like a couple issues of Robin or something, and then I was doing a couple issues at Valiant.
With
And
which Robin would that have been at that point? Was that Jason? No, that would have been Terry. No, what's his name?
Chuck Dixon was writing it at the time, so
Yeah, so it was the
I don't know which one it was. Now that you ask,
now why can't I remember his name? Because now he's the.
well, it wasn't. It might have been Jason Todd. It might have been.
I feel like Jason Todd was already dead in the early '90s. It would have been the other kid.
Oh yeah, he got killed by the Joker. Who got
Jason Todd was killed by the Joker.
Was that Jason Todd? Yeah.
Yeah. So it was the other kid.
Yeah, it wasn't Damian Wayne.
No. He came much later. He was in the mid aughts by the time Damian came around.
Yeah, I couldn't.
Oh man, I'm so ashamed. I need to turn in my
geek
card now for
I
not
know,
remembering.
The name of this podcast is Two Geeks or whatever.
I know,
and you can't even
come
up with Robin's name. But it was during Chuck Dixon's run on it.
Yes. Yeah.
And but anyways, I had a couple issues of that, and then
Tim Drake.
Yes, there you go. So, but nothing really came of that. And then I was again bouncing around, and finally I got a call from an editor at DC, and they had a new series called Tachyon. I wanted to know if I wanted to draw it, and I was like, heck yeah! So I started working on that, and that was when I did Tachyon. And the irony about doing Tachyon, I'll get to in a minute, but that's where I really felt I made a step forward. I thought the stuff looked really good. That's stuff I can look back on now and say, that's still pretty good stuff. And so I had finally sort of made that transition to pretty good professional comic book artist. It was all starting to come together for me.
So I haven't heard of that book. What is Tachyon?
He ended up John Byrne actually took him, and he became part of the New Gods.
Okay.
But I don't know. I've got a Hero Click back there. I don't know if you ever played that game or not, but I've got a Hero Click of Tachyon. So at least they did that. But so it went 7 issues, and it was terrible. Okay.
No.
Who was the writer? Was Kupperberg was the writer, and he was also an editor at DC. And so what I heard from the inside sources was that the book did not do well, and it was a little bit directionless, I think. I'm not sure that Kupperberg knew exactly where he wanted to go with it. I mean, I may be mistaken, but it wasn't coming across that with any sort of big picture to it, right?
Yeah.
And so they canceled it after 7 issues. Well, I took the heat for it because it basically was, Lopresti can't sell a book, so we have no use for him anymore. So there I was struggling to get back in at Marvel and still hadn't been able to do it. And now I'd been cut off by DC because of this book. My understanding was that Kupperberg wasn't doing me any favors in the inside offices of DC either, because he was, my understanding, again, what I heard secondhand was that he was sort of blaming me for the failure of the book. So he didn't have to take any heat for it. And so as a result, I got blacklisted by DC just out of, this guy, we gave him a shot. It, resulted in a poor selling book. And so he's out the door. And so, I was, begging people at Image that I knew, just anybody I could to get work. Right. And there was like a 3-month period where I had nothing. And I took that time to practice my painting, which was great, but it wasn't necessarily the best way to bring income in. And, so I do a few commissions, I do shows, and try and, round up some cash by doing, commissions and selling prints and whatever. But I kept, I would get a job at Image. And then finally Image sent me, when Scott Dunbier at Wildstorm was editor-in-chief, I had known Scott since he was an art dealer. And he sent me they were trying to do a new series. And so I did like 8 issues of it. And I tried to change my style so it was a little bit more hip, anything I could think of, to kind of sort of get back in the good graces. And so after that, I had gone to San Diego, had rolled around, and I had stood in line. You want to talk about humiliating? I'd already been in the industry for 5 or 6 years at this point, and there I am standing in line showing my portfolio to X-Men editors at the Marvel booth.
Wow.
But there I was, and so it was Mark Powers and Pete Franco were the editors there, and I showed them my Tachyon stuff, which they actually thought was pretty good, and they're like, this looks professional. And I'm like, yeah, well, I said, I've been working for a while. I just haven't had anything for a few months. And so, I'm trying to get it going again. And so they called me and offered me an annual, but I said, is the X-Men actually in this? And they were like, well, no, not really. And I said, well, then I have no interest in it, which was a ballsy thing to do.
Yeah.
Because I had no work. But I was
Right.
like, I said, I've got to get off this treadmill of getting, secondhand jobs. And, I gotta impress upon people that, sorry, my hat is driving me crazy here. I'm trying to adjust it here. Okay, there we go. And so I turned them down and I was like, biting my fingernails. But then they called back, a couple of weeks later and said, would you be interested in doing a few fill-in issues on X-Men? And I was like, heck yeah. And it was great because the first thing I did for them was they had a book. They had a book for Wizard Magazine. There was an exclusive Wizard Magazine book called, and it was an Ultimate X-Men, like 16-pager that Jeff Johns of all people was writing. So but it was early Jeff Johns, right? He wasn't Jeff Johns that we know today. He was, starting out Jeff Johns, but it was a great script. And so I did that, and I got Danny Mickey to ink it, which was amazing because he's one of the top inkers in the field. And the stuff and I just really brought it. And Danny knocked it out of the park. It just looked great. It was really good stuff. And so then after that, they go, hey, would you like to do, 4 issues of X-Men or whatever for us? And I said, heck yeah, I'll do that. And so I did the 4 issues of X-Men for them. And then they called me back and they said, this is Pete Franco, who is the assistant editor. He said, look, we're really, really happy with what you're doing on X-Men. We want to make you, and this is verbatim, they said, we want to make you the next big X-Men artist.
Wow.
So I was flipping out, telling my wife, yeah, finally I made it. Woohoo. We're in the money now, royalties and all this kind of stuff. A week later, both him from Pete Franco and Mark Powers got fired. Wow. And so I went from on the verge of being the next X-Men star to having no work again.
Wow.
And it was at that point that CrossGen in the Florida company had come into existence. And Bart Sears, who was the art director at that time, talked to me at San Diego if I'd be interested in moving to Florida and, working for them. Well, here I was just having, gone 3 months without work, finally got back in at Marvel, and then got my head lopped off, you know? And so, I was like, I talked to my wife, she didn't want to move, but I was kind of like, hey, what else are we going to do at this point?
Sure.
And so, we sold our home, moved to Florida, and I worked there at CrossGen for, year and a half, 2 years, whatever it was. It was about 2 years. And then they went under, which most startup companies do. It's inevitable, right? And I told my wife, I said, if we can get 2 years out of this, we're in good shape. But I said,
well, and that's so unfortunate because CrossGen was such a cool concept that you had like this line wide sort of interweaving story that it was all supposed to be building to, and it's really a shame that didn't get they didn't get to really bring it all the way home.
Well, like most startup companies or small companies, they try to expand too fast, and there just wasn't the audience to support it. And so then and plus they were paying all of us to be there, which made no sense, right? So we weren't freelancing like Marvel or DC did. We were actually employees of CrossGen, lived in Florida, went to the big warehouse where all of the studio was, and we all worked there, the writers, the pencilers, the inkers, the colorists. And so, but we had total control, creative control over our projects, whatever we were working on. And because my inker was just a desk away, my colorist was just a desk away, but the writer was just right over there. Yeah. And we could go have conversations anytime during the day and say, hey, this scene isn't working. What do you think about this? Or you'd go to the inker and say, hey, this is what I'm going for here. So they knew exactly what you wanted. And then you'd go into the colorist and say, hey, this is what I'm going for here. And if they did something you didn't like, you could just jump over there and go, hey, change that to this. And it was just so easy, right? And so everybody that worked there did the best work of their careers. And we
Yeah,
were,
the cross-gen stuff is just all, and it's all so beautiful. Like
yeah,
it was
tremendous work.
amazing, amazing art on all of those books. I always love picking them up.
Yeah, and you had this great combination of new talent that was really talented, and or guys like Jimmy Chung, or guys that were sort of cast-offs from mainstream like me. I won't mention anybody else's name because I don't know they want to be characterized as a cast-off, but there were those of us that were industry pros, had been for years, but had just been sort of, pushed out for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And so here we are kind of rejuvenating our careers. And so as CrossGen started to go under and started having financial troubles, we were all, calling Marvel and DC and whatever to try and, and of course they were all aware of what we were doing. They saw the work.
Yeah.
And so, I called up Marvel and they were like, heck yeah. And so they hired me to do 4 issues of Captain Marvel, which I actually drew while I was at CrossGen.
Oh no.
CrossGen was going under, and when someone would come by, I'd hide those and start working on whatever they put me on, and then I would leave it. I mean, I got both the stuff done. Don't get me wrong.
Sure, right, yeah.
I was literally working for 6 months. I worked 7 days a week and was doing 2 pages a day. I'd get up and do the CrossGen stuff, and then in the afternoon, evening, once I finished CrossGen stuff, I would go home and work on Captain Marvel until midnight or whatever, get up the next morning and rinse and repeat for literally 6 months, 7 days a week. It was brutal.
So, so about a page a day, is that what you can normally do?
Right. I was doing 2 pages a day at this point, but it wasn't like I wasn't hacking them out. I was spending 8 hours doing 1 page and then 8 hours doing the next page. It was it was brutal, but I was considerably younger than I am now. And, so anyway, so I kind of solidified myself at Marvel, and that's the amazing thing, to sit there and say I started working in comics. I did my very first job in 1989, or that Solomon Kane 3D, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't until 2002 or 2003 before I sort of solidified my career, where I finally felt like I wasn't looking for my next job every month.
Yeah.
And so I worked there at Marvel for 4 years or so, doing, I did Excalibur with Chris Claremont. I did Sentinel Squad, which is a kind of an X-Men related mini series. I did Planet Hulk. I did Ms. Marvel.
The Sentinel Squad was the thing that happened after Decimation, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember that a little bit.
Yeah. They were these super giant Sentinels, and they were piloted by this team of, experts that would, so it was, they weren't like normal Sentinels. They were twice up, probably.
Yeah.
And so we did that. And then I did What If Avengers Disassembled, which is still my favorite single issue just because I ever did, because it had like almost the entire Marvel universe was in it. And, I was doing covers for their kids line, Marvel Adventures, Avengers.
Yeah.
And, I did some Hulk covers. Then I finally did Planet Hulk, which took me about a year. And then I went from that to Ms. Marvel, which I worked on for almost 2 years. And
just out of curiosity, was that sort of like the big reinvention of Ms. Marvel? Because was that right after House of M?
Yeah, she was still Ms. Marvel, though. She wasn't Captain Marvel at that point.
But that was sort of when she kind of came back to the fore, right? And she had seen what a hero, like what a big deal she was in that alternate reality, and was like, why can't this be my real life? Right. That was sort of her character arc at that time.
Yeah, she after I did Planet Hulk, I did the What If Avengers Disassembled book. And because I was at a position at Marvel where they were, they would find something for me. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Even if something wasn't available, like, oh, you can't take over Spider-Man or whatever because so-and-so's drawing it. But here, do this What If. This will keep you busy for a couple months and then we'll find something else, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I did this What If, which Ms. Marvel had a big part in it. Mm-hmm. And so the Ms. Marvel editor saw that and was like, hey, do you want to take over Ms. Marvel? And I was like, sure. And so then that was on that for, like I said, for like a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was supposed to take over Ultimate Fantastic Four in their Ultimate line.
Oh, wow.
But I got, when I was working on Ms. Marvel, they weren't letting me draw the covers.
Okay.
And that really ticked me off. And so when I agreed to do Ultimate FF, I said, well, I'll do it if I do the covers. And they were like humming and hawing, right? Which really ticked me off. And because I'd been there now for 4 years, I'd been at CrossGen for 2 years, and then all my experience prior to that.
Sure.
So I'd been in the industry now for, 12 years or something. And I was like, are you kidding me? Why is this even an issue?
Yeah.
And so I said, look, let me do a cover for you of something I might do and how I would do it. And then you decide, right? So yeah. I got about halfway through this FF cover and I really started getting angry at myself. I had that Bugs Bunny moment where, Bugs Bunny, I think of where the Robin Hood cartoon.
Yes.
Where he tricks the sheriff of Nottingham into buying land from him that's actually in the Royal Rose Garden. And the sheriff of Nottingham has his house half built before he realizes what an idiot he is, and he just got duped, right?
Yeah.
And so I was halfway done with this cover, and I duped myself. I was like, why am I doing, and I was doing this for free. They weren't paying me. Right. I was doing a sample cover, a 12-year comic book pro, doing a sample cover for the Ultimate. And I was like, I was just furious. And that they were allowing this to go on. Right. And so I called up Dan DiDio at DC, had a long conversation with him. And so we agreed in principle that I would go over to DC, and I was supposed to take over. I was supposed to start Power Girl, but they ended up talking me into taking over Wonder Woman. But anyway, so
was that ended up being the arc that you did with Greg Rucka?
No. Greg was gone. It was Gail Simone.
Oh, Gail Simone. Right.
Yeah. So I was looking at my 2 years.
I was looking at my local library to see if I could find some of your work so I could show my son that I was going to be talking to you on the show, and they actually had a copy of that trade paperback of the run with Gail Simone on Wonder Woman.
There you go.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
But what happened was I finished the FF cover, turned it into them. They said, yeah, these are fine. You can do the covers. And I said, good, because I quit. And I said, you guys showed me such a level of disrespect, I can't even tell you. And I'm not working for you. And then I jumped over to DC, which I'm sure ticked everybody off at Marvel, but, and so then I stayed at, DC for working on Wonder Woman, and then, Justice League International. I did Amethyst. I did, Hawkman stuff. I did the Herculoids. I did a Metamorpho miniseries that I wrote and illustrated. I did Garbage Man, which is my creator-owned project that I did there, wrote and drew. Just, ton of stuff over a 12-year period. And
wow, you were at DC for 12 years.
I know, yeah.
Wow.
Pretty sure it was 12 years. Well, maybe not. Okay, hang on, let me take that back because it was about 12 years.
Wow. And you were actually on JLA for a little while too, right?
Yeah, that was kind of the end of my stint at DC. What happened was that Dan DiDio got let go. AT&T, of course, bought Warner Brothers.
Right.
And they started pushing guys, I guess, to save money, right? So they got rid of Dan. Then they got rid of Mark Chiarello, the art director, who I was also really tight with. And I thought, boy, I'm in trouble because Dan always had my back, right? Because he was the top of the food chain at DC. So if I did a series and I was done with it, limited series or whatever, and then I'd call around to some editors and I'm like, hey, what do you guys got? And they're like, well, I don't know. We don't got anything right now, So then I just call up Dan and go, Dan, I need something. What can you get for me? And then he would always make sure that I had something, right?
Yeah.
And so he got let go. And so I was like, oh my gosh, who's going to take care of me now? But then I was at Chicago, and this was the year the COVID shutdowns, right? It was just, we were
Yeah.
in Chicago in February, I guess, and it was just before they shut everything down.
Yeah.
And so it was one of the editors who had just got hired from someplace else, like heavy metal or something. He happened to be a fan of my Wonder Woman stuff, and he came and talked to me, and he said, "Hey, would you like to, help out on Justice League, because um, who was it? Mankey was doing Justice League at the time, Doug Mankey, and he was behind, so he had to jump way ahead to get the next story arc going, and so there was like 3 or 4 issues, I think 4 issues, maybe more, maybe 6, I can't remember, but so I did the Justice League stuff, and then they wanted to wrap it up as it ended up, the story from that I was working on kind of jumped over and ended up in the annual. So I did that, and then I did the annual, and I think combined the regular issues, then the annual, because the annual is double sized. I think that constituted 6 issues. So it was basically 6 months worth of work or more, 6, 7 months worth of work. And so then September rolls around, and AT&T comes in, and it's Hatchet September, or Bloody September, whatever you call it. And they fired everybody.
Wow.
Right. So everybody that I knew there in an editorial position almost was gone. And so, they fired Bob Harris. They got rid of, this editor that had hired me to do Justice League. They got rid of just everybody that I knew and had worked with for, all these years. And so I sat there and kind of pondered my situation. I said, well, here I am on the high side of 50. And am I going to really go grovel to Marvel and DC, to these 20-something-year-old editors who don't give a rip about me or anything I've done for the past, 25 years, and probably look at me as some old man that they need to move on from? Am I going to beg these guys for work? I said, I'm not going to do it. And I'd been sort of playing around with the idea of starting my own company, publishing my own stuff, crowdfunding, because it was, you're seeing guys like Ethan Van Sciver and others that were doing really, really well in that market. And I kept thinking, maybe I can do that.
So just real quick, aside, since you mentioned Ethan Van Sciver, can you explain Comicsgate to me?
Yeah, can I? Let's see.
if you don't really want to get, because I know it's kind of weird and controversial.
Well, there's no, I will, because there's quite a bit of misperception out there, and it all comes down to a few guys, Ethan and a few other guys, that voted for Trump and got run out of the industry because of that. And so it's kind of which is, to me, is just asinine. It's like, you're suddenly going to start punishing people because, this guy's a conservative or he voted for Trump, and so now he's not getting work. He's not welcome in this industry anymore. And that's essentially what happened to him. But Comicsgate was initially a fan movement that was revolting against mainstream comics for whatever. I wasn't there. I was working at DC. I had no idea what was going on at this period of time. Okay. And so when Ethan got canceled, he sort of attached himself to that and then basically took it over, became the prime wheeler and dealer. And so there was a lot of guys that were involved in it that were unsavory, shall we say. Okay. But they were all out. That whole war of power struggle all happened before I ever even got there. Yeah. And the thing is, Comicsgate is not an organization. Okay. It's not like we go and get a membership card, right? Uh-huh. And Ethan's the grand poobah, and we're all like, his underlings or something. It's not what it is at all. It's basically just a hashtag. It's an umbrella. Okay. Uh-huh. But what you have is quite a few creators, or probably all of them, most of the fans and the supporters of it that hashtag that are people that are sort of anti-woke. Okay. Mm-hmm. They don't like the woke agenda. They don't like the woke politics working its way into mainstream comics. And so you got a bunch of us who are trying to bring back comics to a lot of guys, it was 90s comics or 80s comics. For me, it was 70s and 80s comics, depending on how old you are. But kind of that pure sort of just kind of entertainment comic book it doesn't have to do with all the politics and garbage in it. And so, but what happens is a lot of people don't like Ethan because he's the lightning rod.
Yeah.
And so if you associate with him, oh, you're this, that, you're a Nazi, you're all that, but just ridiculous things, right? That just simply are not true. And so it's kind of like, but everybody does their own thing. No one is overseeing anybody. So if someone goes out there and says, oh, I'm Comicsgate, and they produce a porn comic, right?
Oh, geez.
That has nothing to do with me. I have because it's not like the Royal Order of Water Buffaloes or something from the Flintstones, where we all have hats and, we get together once a month for membership meetings. That's not what it is. It's just a bunch of creators who are loosely connected through the internet, and it's a free speech forum. They came out saying, hey, people got canceled, myself included, or they tried to cancel me, but it's like, I wasn't working in the mainstream anyway, so I don't know what you're canceling me from, but it's like, you just got a bunch of guys and women doing their own books, and they're all sort of like underneath this hashtag that is defined largely by the individual that's there. So it's to suggest it's anything other than maybe a broad movement of people that are rebelling against mainstream comics, which you could say that in kind of a big picture kind of thing. But even that's not entirely true, because there's still people that read mainstream comics that support books by me and Ethan and other people, other creators. Yeah. So it's really hard to nail down and say this is what it is. Okay. But it's just an independent movement of comic creators that want to do their own thing, and maybe, and for the most part, and not entirely, you can't say it's all conservatives, because it's not. You can't say it's all straight white males, because it's not. And so it's just guys doing their own thing outside of the mainstream and being critical of the mainstream, which then ticks them off. So, and which it fuels the hatred for us. But that's not a great explanation, but it's really hard to pin down because it's not an organization. So, there you have it. So if you see something that someone does that says they're Comicsgate, and you're like, whoa, I don't like that at all. That's terrible. Aaron, you're a bad person. I'm like, what? I don't even know this person. Or if I do, I know them loosely. And they're doing whatever they want to do, and no one has any jurisdiction to go in and say, don't do that. You know what I mean? Sure. So it's, that's sort of an explanation for what it is.
Okay. No, I just kind of remember seeing some stuff about it, back a few years ago. And I never really understood what it actually was. So, okay.
I'm not sure anybody does.
All right. So, but anyway, in your story, that kind of takes us up to you feel like you're about to end things at DC, because all of your patrons in DC are gone.
Yes.
And you're getting ready to start your own thing. So what comes out of that?
Well, what I'm doing right now is a book. Well, I did Wraith of God, which was a graphic novel. It was an 84-page graphic novel that it's a Western monster hunter with Christian themes underneath all of it, and which seems like an odd combination, but if you read it, it makes sense. And what I had to do first was I had to understand that when you do these independent books like this, you're cultivating a whole new audience.
Yeah.
Because what you find out in mainstream comics is, when you're working on Wonder Woman, you are the most popular Wonder Woman artist of all time. And then you leave Wonder Woman and nobody cares anymore. They stick with Wonder Woman and you go off, and they don't necessarily follow you. If you're working on Spider-Man, oh, we love you. You're the Spider-Man artist, until you're not working on Spider-Man. They still love Spider-Man, and then they love the new artist that's on there, and then you're off. You know what I mean? It's a
sure.
So no one's following me to do my independent book. I mean, some people do, but I mean, in terms of numbers that you could actually make it viable, they're not there. Yeah. So what you found out was you have to cultivate this audience. So I started YouTubing, right? Started my own channel, started, doing drawing on YouTube and just, doing all sorts of things. And of course, this was during COVID when I first started doing this. So I was doing online cons, just me.
Yeah.
And those were, you'd bring in viewership and slowly your channel starts to grow. And I mean, right now I'm at 2,500 subs on my YouTube channel, which isn't great. I mean, there's people out there that are 10,000. Ethan's got 147,000 subs. I mean, that's like next level stuff, Eric July's got like 500,000, So I'm small compared to these guys, but we're seeing steady growth. And what you find out is that's how you promote yourself, gain an audience. Then you start promoting your projects. And then after you've been promoting them for a while, then you launch, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got hopefully enough support that you can actually raise enough money to do the book, which happened with Wraith of God. And right now I'm doing the sequel, Wraith of God, Blood Hunters. And that's currently funding right now on Indiegogo. Unfortunately, a group of us are being shadow banned, we believe for political reasons, welcome to the 21st century, right? By Indiegogo, which means that you can't just go to Indiegogo and search me and it'll come up. You have to have the direct link to the campaign to find it. And so I'm constantly posting that stuff on Twitter, Facebook, on my YouTube channels. Whenever I do a video or a show, I'll post the link so people have that direct link. But it's made it harder for us to get people to the site because of this. But it's what you're dealing with in the political landscape of today. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of how it is.
So I'm doing a quick experiment here. I'm searching you Indiegogo right now. I'm going to see what comes up. Let's see.
It'll show my original graphic novel, which is closed.
Yeah.
It's sold out.
But I see Chrome Dog.
Yeah, I'm doing a cover for that. I did a cover for that.
I see a Garbage Man has ended. Kayless.
Those are all old campaigns.
All the stuff that's ended.
But you won't find Blood Hunters. Wait for God.
Wow. Huh. How about that?
Yep.
Crazy. And it is an active campaign on there, but it won't.
Yeah. You just have to have the direct link or you can't get to it.
That's wild.
And they've done this to several guys, all people that are, Comicsgate or comics associated with Comicsgate or whatever. They've done this too, but not everybody. That's the weird thing. There's still male and female creators that haven't been shadow banned. We raised an amazing amount of noise about it, and they never responded to why we were shadow banned and what they were doing and why they were doing it. And but some people seem to have avoided it while others have not. So it's really kind of a mystery, and people are now, it's pushed us all to sort of like figure out how we can do our own platforms so that we're not subject to someone's political ideology that happens not to like us at that period of time and then decides to do something, to inhibit our careers. So
crazy.
But most of us are in that transitional period where we're trying to figure it out, and we still have to use the platforms that are available, like Indiegogo, even though they're not treating us well in that regard. But we're still forced to use them. Kickstarter it used to be Kickstarter was the one that was, gatekeeping certain people out, but now their staff is flipped, and now they're actually running like a good, responsible business, trying to make money, without worrying about if someone's a conservative or a liberal, but they're not a great platform for comics. They're more a great platform for art books, and Indiegogo has really sort of established itself as the independent comic launch pad. And so we hate to leave it, even though they're hurting us by not making our campaigns available to everybody directly, or indirectly, I guess I should say. Right. So we're kind of in that period, right? We're trying to figure out how we can do our own thing and, avoid this stuff.
Yeah. How is your campaign for the sequel going right now?
Well, it's doing really well, but it stalled out when it was active for 45 days, and then it went into in demand, which is basically means it's still active, but it's not It's just terminology. I mean, it's still as active as it ever was, but we basically, you say, you really push hard for 45 days or 60 days, and then the campaign closes, but it can still go into demand, which means it's kind of a store option and people can go in and back whenever they want, as long as it stays open. So it's doing really well. It's not doing as well as my first one ended at, right? But I'm not at the ending point yet, so I don't know where it's going to end up at. But they say Indiegogo claims are responsible for about 15 to 20% of your traffic, just people going to the site and randomly looking. But they've taken that away from us. So we have to assume that we're 15% behind where we would be had they not done that.
Sure.
So, it's doing well, but it's not doing as well as it would have been doing probably had the shadow banning not occurred. But it is still doing. I mean, I can't complain. I'm not going to sit here and complain that it's not doing well, because it is. But it should be doing better than it is, I guess I should say.
Okay. All right.
And at this point, I'm probably about halfway done with the book. So it'll be done this summer sometime, and then we'll go to the printer and everybody will get it. Depending on how long the printing takes, because that's a whole another thing that we have to deal with is supply chain issues, paper availability, printers being backed up, all this as a trickle down from the COVID shutdowns, right?
Right.
And it still isn't caught up. So, I don't know where they're going to be at, in July or August when I send this to the printer, but, so we're sort of at their mercy. But the book will be done, this summer, and then we'll get it out as soon as we get it back from the printers. So
cool. All right. Hey, so there's one thing that I meant to ask you last time that I got lost in another little notepad file that I didn't have open. I was creeping your Wikipedia page before we talked, and
ages. What are they saying about me?
Well, so one thing caught my notice that I wanted to ask you about. It says you have Chuck Jones listed as an artistic influence.
Yes. So
I'm curious about what element of your of your style do you feel like it comes from Chuck Jones?
It's not so much that when I list people as influencers, there are people that influenced my career and my style in different ways. Like William Stout was a guy that I don't draw like Stout at all, but he really made me understand the business side of it and helped me. Mike Plug is another guy I don't really draw like, but I just have such a great appreciation for him as a person and how he handles himself and his artwork as well. Chuck Jones, the thing that I took from Chuck Jones is how he was able to give his characters a three-dimensional quality. Okay. And what I mean by that is you look at somebody like Friz Freeling, who is a great animator, or was a great animator, but his stuff was a little flat to me. And there's a couple guys, Chuck Jones being the most prominent, that him and his animators, you can't dismiss them, Ben Washam and Abe Lebeteau and other guys that worked with him regularly. They drew, like if you look at Frazetta's drawings and stuff, they're bumpy. And I know this sounds really weird, but if you do I'm trying to articulate something that's completely visual, you know what I mean? So it's hard to, I'm trying to think of the right descriptives here, but if you look at like Freeling, there's like this smooth line quality, you know what I mean? Where like if the coyote by Chuck Jones was hunched over like he is, hunched over doing mad scientist stuff, you'll find that it's his back isn't just this slick curved line. It's a bumpy line that articulates the mass of his back, and his arms are, they're articulated in a way visually with the line quality that makes you feel like there's a meaty three-dimensional quality. And Frazetta did this in how he draws. If you look at his illustrations, not just his paintings, but his line work, like a guy's forearm was not just a straight line on one side and a straight line on the other. It's this bumpy line that, that conveys a musculature, and it conveys this weightiness to the character. And that's something that Chuck Jones always brought, which was really amazing because he wasn't using shadows or anything to do it. He was using the lines, how they were animating the characters gave it this sort of three-dimensional quality. And I hadn't understood. To me, that was something that's always important in comics as well, or just drawing in general. You can draw something that's really slick and finished and tight and is beautiful line work, but it feels flat. Because it's like, it's so perfect and the lines are so perfect and so slick that it kind of, there's no life to it. There's no energy to it. And so figuring out how to take a two-dimensional object or drawing and make it feel weighty and three-dimensional, those are things that I took from Chuck Jones, not to mention his, the way you exaggerate something or, convey an emotion through exaggeration or a physical comedy or whatever. That's what you can grab from animators. And then kind of, if you're not trying necessarily to do an animated influenced style, which I don't do, but it's that weightiness and the motion and the exaggeration that kind of works its way into your work.
Okay. That's really cool. All right. Well, hey, man, this has been super cool. I appreciate your time again.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I'm looking at the live button up there, and it's recording. It's showing how much time we spent. So I know it's recording right now.
Yeah, that's really good. All right. Well, I'm having trouble finding my story that I wanted to share for our guaranteed good news today. I remember a little bit enough about it that I'm just gonna mention it. And then we'll put the link in the show notes. Well, it was about this woman who set the world record for rowing across the Atlantic Ocean. And she was it was actually kind of a race that she was in, and not there with other people, but just
against time, right? She was trying to be the fastest.
Trying to be the fastest. She had to have all of her supplies with her, and something really interesting that she said in the story was like the hardest part was like the last 8 to 10 miles of the trip, just getting, crossing the finish line, really, making that last push to make it happen. And so it's a really cool story. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's well worth your time to check out because it's super inspiring.
It's amazing to go across the Atlantic. I mean, you think about I don't know exactly where she went across, but you have to be very fortunate, and maybe they chart out the weather and they took the best time of the year to do it. But you're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and what if a storm hits, or what if the wind starts blowing? You have these like 20-foot waves. I mean, I can't even imagine. I'd be terrified.
No, it took her.
Kudos to her.
It took her a long time, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was like, I want to say it was months.
I can't even imagine
how
difficult that would be.
Wild.
That's amazing.
Wild. Yeah. Well, anyway, thanks again for coming. Everybody out there, you can we'll get a link. Aaron, we'll get a link. Send me a link to your your Kickstarter
direct
campaign.
Links,
we'll put that in the show notes as well, so that anybody who wants to back your campaign can do that. I am starting to reach out. I have an active Patreon page for myself at this point, because I would love to not keep paying for the hosting for this show all by myself.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, you guys can you can join our Discord server. I'll put a link to that because I would love to start making this a little bit more of a community of our listeners. If you have any guaranteed good news stories that you would like for me to share on the show, I really want to hear about that. We're still on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook at 2geeksoup.com. Or no, just at 2geeksoup. We don't have our own domain. It's just at 2geeksoup at those other places. But Again, it was great to have you here, Aaron. Thanks. And even though it means that I'm probably the aging hippie art teacher, this podcast is a proud member of the More Than One Lesson faculty.